When we buy an e-bike, two of the primary performance measures we look at, particularly related to the motor, are power and torque. But what do power and torque really mean, and how important are they? And what's most important? Well, I ride e-bikes, and I'm also a mechanical engineer, so I understand the physics behind torque and power. This video is going to be my attempt to explain that set of physics to you, so you can understand what torque and power really means when it comes to an e-bike. Make the decision for yourself. What's more important? Or is it important? And what kind of power and torque should I have in my e-bike? Okay, so I've got my props. And in order to describe torque and power, I want to describe two other physics concepts, and that is force and work. So the first, which is force, is the most simple. And force is, for instance, when I apply some strength of my arm to this weight here and try to move it against gravity, I'm applying a force to it. It's not moving, but I'm still applying a force. And that's important. I'll get to that in a minute. So applying a force, and that force is measured in either newtons or pounds force. We just call it pounds. Now, if I take that same weight and I move it from here to here, a distance, that's work. So it takes movement to create work. So movement from here to here, going up there, is work. It's the force I applied to that weight times the distance, and that can be measured also. Okay, so now that we know what work is, what is power? Well, power is simply how quickly I move it from here to here. So I do the same amount of work to get it from here to here, but different amount of power. If I move it slowly like this, that's a certain amount of power. If I move it quickly, it's a different amount of power. Because power is the amount of work I've done divided by the amount of time. So the less time, the more power. Okay, now let's talk about torque. And to demonstrate torque, I'm going to use the bike, because torque requires a center point. Torque is simply force, like I'm applying to this pedal, multiplied by the distance to that center point. So force is something I'm putting on this pedal, and I'm doing it now. Torque is what's being created, the force that's being created around that center point. That's the torque. So it can be measured by this force multiplied by this distance. If this distance is longer, I'm creating more torque. If the force is greater, I'm creating more torque. Okay, so now what is power related to this configuration? Well, it's the same thing it was when I was moving the weight. I'm applying a force, and I'll do it over a distance. Let me go the opposite direction. I do it over a distance. Now I've got movement, I've created work, and depending on how fast I do this, the power is either greater or less. So this is less power, the same amount of torque. That is more power with the same amount of torque. So power is simply torque applied at a speed. So let's talk about motors for a second. How do they create torque and power? Well, to understand motors, you have to understand magnets. If you've ever played with a magnet, and I'm sure you have, and you'll begin to put it next to something that's metal that a magnet can attract, you'll notice that it begins to move that metal before it touches it. Same thing if you've got two magnets and they're opposing one another, you push one towards the other, it moves that magnet before it ever touches it. So that's why they use magnets and motors, so they don't have to touch one another in order to apply a force. The other thing about motors and the magnets in motors is they're electromagnets. So they're not like the kind of magnets that we play with as a child. They are coils that have electricity running through them that create a magnetic field that do the same thing as a magnet. The beauty of that is the more current you run through those electromagnets, the stronger those magnets become. So motor manufacturers will use that technology in order to move the crank of this bike with the magnets of the motor by applying more or less current to the motor. The more current, the more torque. The less current, the less torque. Okay, what about power? Well, the faster that motor can spin while still applying the same amount of torque, the more power it will have. It's that simple. And so why aren't all motors super powerful? Well, obviously, some motors are larger, have bigger magnets, have more capacity to accept current, and can apply more torque at a higher speed, perhaps, while other motors, like on this bike, are smaller, they're lighter, have lighter magnets, they're more compact, but they don't create as much torque or as much power. Now, there's one other thing we need to talk about in terms of these motors, and these are both DC motors, and every e-bike we have has a DC motor, I think. DC motors, most motors, but DC motors in particular, as the RPM increases in the motor, as the motor begins to spin up, the amount of torque that can apply using those magnets goes down. It's very linear. You can look at it on a graph. So as just begin to apply a force, the maximum amount of torque that that motor can apply is applied to that crank, assuming they've ramped up all the current. But as that crank starts to move around, as it starts to chasing that armature in the motor, as it starts chasing the item that's moving, it's harder and harder for it to apply the torque. So the torque goes down, but the power does not go down. And the reason that is because power, remember, is that torque divided by time. So the faster it moves, the power begins to go up. So even though the torque is going down, the power is going up. And you can see that it's plotted on a curve. This is a typical curve that you would see on a DC motor. So you can see that the torque is going down. And while the torque goes down, the power goes up to a point. Just the way the mathematics works out, eventually that power output starts to level off and then begins to drop. And that's why you will see power curves on these motors that are measured that have peaks on them. Generally, that peak is at an optimum RPM that we ride our bikes. That's how these motors are designed. So a motor doesn't just have these mechanisms of magnets and coils that run the current through them. A motor will also have gearing in it. That's what allows the motor to be used in a bicycle, because motors typically put that maximum power out at about 3,600 RPM, plus or minus 1,000 or so. That's way faster than any of us can pedal. So they don't want that spindle spinning at 3,600 RPM. We'd never be able to use it. So there's gearing in this motor, and there's gearing in that motor that bring it down to something that's usable. Typically somewhere between 60 RPM and 120 RPM, which is what most people pedal, the rate most people pedal. And the different motors will choose a different optimum point for the rotational speed of that motor to hit its maximum power. So that allows us to use the maximum power from the bicycle. We pedal right at that speed. Of course, we're not always riding at the same speed. So that's why you have gearing in the back of the bicycle. So we can change the speed of the bicycle, but still continue to pedal at the best RPM for the motor. And so if the RPM of the motor optimum is 60 RPM, but we want to be riding the bike faster, then we gear up. If we want to be riding the bike slower, we gear down. We're not always using the maximum power output of an e-bike. When you do, it's when you start going uphill. And if you start going up a much steeper hill, or you're much heavier, or you're going against wind, it's going to take gearing down to be able to get up that hill with the same amount of power, because you're applying more torque. So if you're going along a straight, flat road, you may not be applying much torque, and you may not be using the maximum amount of power. But let's say, for instance, you're going up a 2% grade, and you're riding along and you're in a pretty high gear and you're able to maintain, say, 18 miles an hour right at the maximum that the bike is limited, and you're using the maximum amount of power to do it because you've got enough weight and you're going against enough of a slope of a hill, and then all of a sudden the grade goes up. I've heard it said that you can't use all the power that comes out of these bikes because the speed is limited. That is absolutely untrue. As you know, as you start going up a steeper and steeper hill, you cannot keep your speed up. Power is what allows you to keep that speed up. And eventually you may get to a steep enough hill, a hard enough effort that you're only going 5 miles an hour or 7 miles an hour, and you're putting out the maximum power you and the bike can apply. So power is definitely usable on these bikes, given the amount of limits that we have on e-bikes. You can always use more power. So that brings us to what's more important, torque or power. Well, hopefully by now you realize they're just two different terms to describe what's going on. Torque is the amount of force that the motor or your legs are applying to the transmission of the bicycle to get it moving. But once it starts moving, and once you know how fast it's moving and how fast that torque can move you, now you're talking about power. So power is the torque applied and how quickly it's applied. Now there's a lot more going on here that I haven't covered in this video. Please subscribe, give me any comments, let me know if this has been helpful, because I plan to produce 2 more videos. One will talk a little bit more about how different motor manufacturers apply torque and power to these e-bikes and what might be most useful to you, as well as the controls that they put on the motors that make that power and that torque a little more usable. The other thing we haven't talked about is how is power assist applied. I mean, obviously we're pushing on these pedals at the same time. What is it that's measuring how much we're pushing on those pedals, and how is that applied to the motor, and how is that information sent to the motor to tell the motor when to give it more power or more torque? That's something I'll cover in 2 more videos. They're coming up. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, subscribe, let me know what you think, give me some comments. If you found anything in this video that is wrong, please let me know. I'll promise to put it at the top of the comments so anybody else that's watching the video can see it. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.